Hello, my name is Chris Green. My final project presentation for MSDS 670 is a series of visualizations examining global carbon dioxide emissions from 1960 to 2010. Climate change remains a contentious topic in global forums. Countries continue to argue over the sources of global warming and the solutions to the problem. One largely accepted contributor to global climate change is the emission of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. Some have argued that less developed countries are responsible for a significant percentage of carbon emissions due to their inability or unwillingness to implement cleaner energy programs. Lower income nations counter this argument, pointing to larger countries as being responsible for the bulk of CO2 emissions. The research question for this project is, were lower income countries responsible for increased global CO2 emissions? The core data for this presentation came from a 2016 World Bank dataset that covered CO2 emissions by country from 1960 to 2011. This dataset provided country-level numbers for both per capita emissions and total emissions in metric tons. The dataset also provided emissions data split by region and income level. While this dataset was fairly straightforward, the country list was mixed in with territories, protectorates, and regional combinations. In order to normalize the countries, I supplemented this data with country names and population data from worldometers.info and ISO-compliant country codes from datahub.io. This provided a means to clean the country list for geospatial plots and ensured any comparisons were made off a common baseline. These additional data sets also provided additional economic and population numbers. I also chose to stick with a clean 50 years of data, only looking at 1960 to 2010. To keep the visuals consistent and eliminate any issues with large versus small countries, I focused on per capita numbers. This allowed for a true comparison of countries and regions. Finally, for this project, I replaced null values with 0. The visual impact was negligible and allowed for the creation of a complete heat map in Seaborn. The prepared data was sliced for each visualization. Choroplasts were produced in Excel, the heat map was produced using Seaborn for Python, and the remaining charts and sparklines were produced within Excel. For results, it is clear that there's been 50 years of global CO2 growth. Global CO2 emissions increased between 1960 and 2010. This growth occurred in nearly every state and region. While North America and Western Europe remained steadily high, many countries increased their CO2 levels during the period, with some in Asia and the Middle East rivaling North American levels. These increases were the greatest in rapidly developing regions. The increase in emissions was most pronounced in regions where political or economic changes occurred. China saw a gradual increase in emissions beginning around 1979, when it first opened its economy and began its decades-long period of economic growth. After the final dissolution of the USSR in 1991, Europe and Central Asia experienced the most dramatic increase in emissions in the period. This is possibly linked to the rapid industrialization and economic growth in the former Soviet states. The Middle East was another region with increased emissions. This seemed to be cyclical in nature and reflective of world energy demands. Within this data, it became clear that lower income countries were not the problem. Despite the overall growth in emissions, it is clear that lower income countries were not the largest contributors. High income countries produced the most CO2 per person by a large margin, regardless of the fact that their emissions were not increasing significantly. Even combining the emissions amounts from all of the other income levels would not equal the amount generated by the high income countries. Given the trend lines, lower income countries may close the gap, but are unlikely to surpass the emissions levels of high-income countries. The original research question was, were lower income countries responsible for increased CO2 emissions? It is clear this is not the case. While accounting for only 18% of the global population, high-income countries produced over 75% of the CO2 during the period. Assuming that this trend has not changed since 2010, any effective global regime designed to reduce CO2 emissions will likely need to address the issue in high-income countries before imposing regulations on middle or low-income countries.